Why is a lattice design so important? What could a bunch of simple squares or diamond shapes possibly have to do with equality and commitment? A design of lattice work appears almost everywhere. In its simplest form, the lattice is a basic geometric form, interwoven materials creating squares or diamonds. The most common visual of a simple latticework design that a majority of people will have seen is a chain link fence, or less menacing, a screen door. Meanwhile, the trellis, more specifically the garden trellis on which climbing flowering plants or ivies have a tradition of growing. In his text on the science and treatment of botany, Pliny the Elder wrote in the 1st and 2nd century CE how useful trellises, pergolas, and green tunnels were in the course of gardening. They were closing off a garden space, even while giving an area more opportunity to grow. The open artwork and architectural style of latticework appears in everything from jewelry to windows, from towers to embroidery, and from pottery to sculptures. My name is Renee. You're listening to Detours in Archaeology. This is a discussion of open lattices. There are many routes that one can go walking on within this particular open topic. The larger episode, Saga, will focus on the instances where the meaning ascribed to pictures with these particular designs vary between markers of public and open spaces versus areas that were hidden from view. This portion in particular will look at the earliest examples and their descriptions of the lattice as a legal netting. The most wide-reaching description of the particular meanings can be qualified between a gateway against a fence or a wall, and the differences between public legal use and private household uses. As designs appear worldwide showing many hundreds of variations, the architectural purpose of including lattice work and the notion of a public area will differ, especially based on the rulers in charge and the century in which they lived. But even if the lattice design could be seen as maybe contradictory when looked at from a worldwide context, which is pretty ridiculous on its own, the lattice has also been used as a design for privacy, as a catcher of false promises, and a gateway. With any name, the lattice is an invitation for some and a wall to others. Looking at netting, in Mesopotamian prehistory, the cylindrical steels were identifiers of leaders, and their transportation around the Fertile Crescent and their discovery in Egypt demonstrates widely expanding borders. An example of this was found in Naga ed-Dur, one of 4 such seals that was all of the Jamnatur Nasran styles and has the lattice design patterned with a fish motif. This style comes from the quintessential Tel or settlement mound in Iraq, and thus giving the period 31,000 to 29,000 BCE the same name. This period followed the Proto-Literate or prehistoric period in Mesopotamia, even though it only comes into vague timely contact with Egypt's also prehistoric Gerzeh or Naquadah II culture from 35,000 to 32,000 BCE. Another example of the net lattice, shown more literally, is seen in a seal relating to the myth of Inanna or Ishtar and then her husband Dumuzid descent into the underworld, dating back to the Achaemenid in the 3rd millennium BCE, before the Sumerian version came out from the 3rd dynasty of Ur, which runs from 2112 to 2004 BCE. It appears most like the lattice is a cage or a net as punishment for Dumuzid after Inanna was trapped while in the underworld before returning to life again thanks to the androgynous figures Galatura and Kerjara, who were made special by the god Enki. Upon returning to the mortal world, Gala demons came after Inanna and told her that someone needed to take her place. With most of her close servants properly mourning her, the next person they visited was Dumuzid, who was living like a lavish king in his wife's absence. Due to this insulting display, Inanna had the Gala demons drag him down to the underworld until the events of the myth of Dumuzid's dream. Another Babylonian reference to the lattice is from the myth of Etana, composed in 21,000 BCE. Etana is a Sumerian king who supposedly lived in the 3000s BCE. This king, in the myth, ascends to heaven on an eagle and is known as he who stabilized the lands. In the Babylonian state, the capital of which was Babylon, under the Achaemenid Empire, with its founding dating back to 2334 BCE, there was a text of the myth that made this ritual clear. The myth of Etana, however, was interwoven over several centuries with a folk legend about the eagle and the serpent. But the myth itself follows part of the life of the heirless king Etana, who provides daily sacrifices to the god Shamash. Shamash instructs King Etana to cross over the mountain where he'd find an eagle that will guide him to the plant of birth. In the folk story, which turns into a backstory in the larger myth, the eagle and the serpent had made a solemn oath of friendship to each other, to protect and provide for each other and each other's young. This plan had worked for a time, but the eagle conceived of evil in his heart and broke his oath, and devoured the snake's young. The snake asked Shamash to punish the eagle, who was able to be captured by the snake with a lattice net that came down from flanking columns. That is when Etana showed up, and the eagle, being carried with broken wings, led Etana to the plant of birth, which worked and provided Etana with a long line of succession. In this myth, the lattice net is part of the trap and may influence later mythology, with a regular net being used the same way, as punishment for those who would break their sacred oaths. In the Greek and Roman world, what would lead to the European tradition, the latticework enclosing a generally open area is called transena in Italian. This gardening practice dates back to the classic period of ancient Greece and Rome, from the 8th century BCE to the 6th century CE. While researching this one particular word, an interesting contradiction came to light regarding the difference between the English common usage and the direct Italian to English translation. Rather than being the assumed general architectural style of its open flow, the translation was either hurdle, according to Google Scholar's automatic translation software, to block off, or a barrier, with only Merriam-Webster stating transena as a lattice or screen of stone or metal enclosing and protecting a shrine, with others including that they mainly appeared in early Christian stone architecture. These artistic styles mainly appear when the shrines are no longer automatically open for all people to visit as temples and open-air shrines. While this isn't a straight contradiction, it shows just how many assumptions might occur based on the slight variation of definition and culture over the centuries. In the Latinate world, one only needs to look at the capitals themselves. The earliest examples noted by passers-by are the short fences with the lattice design and stout height. They are not much of a hurdle, and appearing as a point on designed architecture. Also, the windows are lined with stone or marble, and the spaces are sometimes filled with a clearer, thinner material such as alabaster. This is due to their original use as a public area identifier, being the most important symbol to come out of the myth of the Dioscoros. The Sparta columns connect to the myth of the Dioscoros, which translates to sons of Zeus, and include the goddess in between. To summarize the myth from which arose the Takana in Hesiod's Yogas, the mortals Castor and Pollux, aka Polydeuces, were the twin sons of the Spartan queen Leda and Zeus disguised as a swan, and raised with Leda's husband Tyndareus. During their life, they accompanied the heroes of Jason's Argonauts, joined in the Caledonian boar hunt, rescued their kidnapped sister Hellene after destroying Athens, raped their cousins, another set of twin brothers, Licinius and Idas of Messenia's betrothed, the Laocopides, the daughters of the White Horse, Phoebe and Hilaira, and as their last act, shared the fate of a grave in the valley of Therapnae. They had a complex story. Their sister Hellene was the same as Helen of Troy, but the twins died before she was kidnapped years later by Paris and taken to Troy, so they didn't participate in the Trojan War. When Castor fell in battle, Polydeuces got revenge and then was killed by Ida, who Zeus then struck with a lightning bolt before making Polydeuces a god. Because of the brothers' connection of love and friendship, Polydeuces refuses to rise if his brother stays dead. Zeus acquiesced and brought Castor up as well, giving them access to both the mortals and the gods on alternating days. The Gemini twins also became the gods of St. Elmo's fire, an electric discharge which appears on the rigging of ships, portending deliverance from a storm, along with horsemanship and the protection of travelers and guests, as they were constantly traveling between and were the guests of the two realms. These brothers appear on coinage, in paintings, as statues on shrines, and had their own temples. Here, as well as in the Mesopotamian region, lattices were important for making oaths and contracts while in their presence as the gods were watching. This shows up in mythology with their sister Hellene as the third pillar as a subject between them, providing the connection. Alternately, because the twins' visages often appear flanking roads or votive offering shrines for travelers or guests, the twin motif provides its connection, which was deeply ingrained in the society of the time. But most importantly to the lattice point, the Spartan and iconic representation of the Tai Dai or the Dioscuri was the two upright posts joined by a crossbar called the Dokana, meaning beam figure. In Laconia, the region of southern Greece in which Sparta ruled, their prodigal daughter and sometimes goddess Helen or Helene has been pictured in reliefs from before the 2nd century BCE as a stiff xolonon, or wooden image. On the Laconian cup from 550 BCE shows a lattice between two snake-entwined pillars, one of which is depicted as behind another lattice. The Dokana relief moved from the Laconia Spartan lotus flower to the Greek world through the lattice design, with the belief that between the vertical pillars, Hellene watches as an oath goddess along with her brothers. This connection is derived from her epithet Ramusian in nearby Attica, where Athens lies, where she is typically depicted with a torch or wicker basket because of their presence in underground repositories and treasuries. This is believed to be another link to Babylonian texts due to the position of her handmaids as watchers being comparable to the Babylonian Naditu or businesswoman priestesses as treasury protectors. The goddess in the window is also sometimes shown as either Hera or Aphrodite, with connections to either of two larger myths, with the lattice acting as a net. The bindings of either seated Hera or Ares and Aphrodite as an ensnared pair are tied up by Hephaestus at Mount Etna as his main mythological home. In the case of Hera, only her son Hephaestus was a sort of screw you to Zeus after Athena burst out of his head. Hera wanted a child of her own, her singular own. When he was born, however, either he was already disfigured or she changed her mind for some other reason and tossed him off of Mount Olympus. Since he is a god, he did survive and grew up to become the god of smithing and craftsmanship. All that's to say that in one of the stories of the mythos, Hephaestus captures Hera and holds her as his prisoner, though eventually he does let her go after she shares some kind words. I mean, they are family. What is substantial about this turn of events is that Hera was a goddess of oath-keeping. She was a goddess of marriage, and so having her be the one wrapped up as an oath breaker in terms of abandoning her child, while also being the main goddess that a person in ancient Greece or Rome, as Juno, would make oaths in front of as a witness, is pretty interesting to me. The same kind of contradiction and logic appears when the ensnared gods are Aphrodite and Ares. Long story short, the two of them are having an affair after Aphrodite is forced to marry Hephaestus by Zeus, with Helios' help, and Hephaestus catches them in a net while they are together to expose them to the other gods. Hephaestus drags them up Mount Olympus where the other gods mock and laugh at them, though no one seems to be particularly disgusted or angry with their actions of adultery, other than Hephaestus. Hephaestus was persuaded by Poseidon to free them if Ares paid a fine. In the aftermath, Aphrodite gave birth to Harmonia, Ares' daughter. Hephaestus made a cursed necklace for Harmonia that brought tragedy to anyone who owned it. And some sources say that Aphrodite and Hephaestus divorced, but not all of them. This is yet another example of making oaths before oath breakers. Perhaps as a warning that if you don't keep the oath you're swearing to, this could happen to you. There is another contradiction between Sparta and Athens as it applies to the lattice design and how it applies to the gods, since they were so often adversaries. In Athens, it was Apollo who had the title prostates, meaning one who stands before, and the name variant Apollon, which appeared in the meanings of the words for meetings and sheepfolds, the latter of which is described as a lattice-like fence where meetings would often take place. This is also continued in Judaism through the stories of Samson and, separately, the pillars of Solomon's temple in Israel. In the story of Samson's marriage, the mention of lattice is a more blink and you'll miss it moment. It goes like this, but skipping forward a bit. At the window of my house, I looked down through the lattice. I saw among the simple, I noticed among the young men, a youth who had no sense. He was going down the street near her corner, walking along in the direction of her house at twilight as the day was fading as the dark of night set in. It was Proverbs 7:22. But it comes up directly after Samson's father is warning him against adulterous women, and he is looking through a window screen, which I'll go into later in the series. But maybe the symbolic meaning of lattice work could play into this simple statement. The adulterous woman would clearly not be keeping oaths, and the senseless young man walking to her house is going to be, in a sense, ensnared, while Samson is watching from behind the lattice, on the other side, where he could still keep his oaths. In simplifying the translation of the Bible's text from the English Standard Version, 1 Kings 7. In the Temple of Solomon, quote, there were lattices of checkerwork with wreaths of chainwork for the capitals on the tops of the pillars, a lattice for one capital and a lattice for the other. Obviously, there are so many different translations and basically innumerable interpretations of what that entire passage means. But in this case, if the tradition of netting and lattice work did in fact carry over, maybe the pillars are for the different lords of the capitals, for them to be closer to God, and the lattice work and chains would act as reminders of them making their oaths before God. But I am no biblical scholar, so take it with a heaping pile of salt. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Detours in Archaeology, discussions of the open lattice. This is part 1 of a 2-part episode. The next one will be about the lattice design and its meaning as a mechanism for taking oaths in front of and as a statement of equality. As always, I would like to thank everyone for your patience with my terrible pronunciation of different names and any foreign language words or even English words that I am pronouncing incorrectly. If you have any corrections that you can give me, any extra information, or any questions, do not hesitate to email me at detoursinarchaeology@gmail.com, or you can leave a comment on this podcast episode, or you can go over to my website and leave a comment there. While you're over at my website, I encourage you to read through any article that you want, look at the beautiful pictures, and maybe that'll inspire you to listen to more of the podcast episodes. Please subscribe for my future episodes. Head to my shop on Printify. It is detours-in-archaeology.printify.me. I'll be back in 3 weeks with the second and final part of this topic, and then we'll be moving to other cultures' interpretation of what the lattice means. By the time you hear this, I will be partly through my trip in Asia, and be sure to watch out for different videos, recordings, and art that would show up on my Instagram and my Patreon, which you can also follow for free. And it would be great if anyone has any suggestions of places we should go in either Mongolia or Korea. Hey, email me. We are on tour, so you can't do everything, but I'm so in. Definitely try. Fun fact for today, since for me it was Valentine's Day on Friday, I'm going to talk about the world's oldest love poem. In the earliest known writing system, which was cuneiform, was initially for bookkeepers to track beer and food rations and, exchanging money, exchanging items, or some kind of money. Eventually, the tablets became a home to more interesting reading material, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh, but also professions of love and passion. Historians now believe that the world's oldest romantic poem was written in cuneiform 4,000 years ago, sometime around 2000 BCE. It's called the Love Song for Shu Sin, and the poem expresses affection between Inanna, who I talked about earlier in this episode, the Sumerian goddess of love, and Shu Sin, the king of You'll notice it's not her husband. Was a Mesopotamian city that once stood in present-day southern Iraq. Despite being uncovered at an archaeological dig site in the late 19th century, so the 1800s, the clay tablet featuring the love song for Shu Sin sat untranslated for decades. It was tucked into storage in the Istanbul Museum in Turkey. The ancient notepad went unnoticed until 1951 when scholar Samuel Noah Kramer deciphered its inscription and interpreted its meaning. He surmised that the poem wasn't just a statement of love, but was part of a larger religious ceremony. Each year, the Sumerian king was responsible for symbolically marrying the goddess Inanna to ensure prosperity and bountiful harvests in the year ahead. While Shu Sin, who ruled from 1973 to 1964 BCE, was featured in a series of other poems, researchers aren't sure about the details of the ritual. But even without us knowing more, the poem does remain historically significant and shapes our understanding of early writing and world history. It has 30 lines. It was just one of many poetic professions of love throughout history, and some of them are so much longer. If you have any fun true facts that you want to share, again, hit me up. All the music was from Scott Buckley and can be found at scottbuckley.com.au. Have a great day. Join me next time for a continuation of our detour into archaeology. Thanks again.